Well, let me start with a declaration that a few other people have made previously. I'm not an epidemiologist, but in my case I really am not an epidemiologist. I'm a psychologist, and I began my career as a clinical psychologist working in the prison system. And for reasons I hope will be very clear by the end of my talk, I found that towards the end, a fascinating job, but ultimately very unrewarding in terms of doing anything at all about the problem of crime. I've been in the UK, some with a very fine ear will detect I don't have an English accent. Came from Australia about 3 years ago to take up the directorship of the Jill Dando Institute. You may or may not have heard of us. You've probably heard of Jill Dando, particularly if you're British. She was murdered in 1999, as you remember. She used to co-present Crime Watch, and her co-presenter Nick Ross decided as a tribute to her he'd set up an institute that was devoted solely to the issue of crime prevention. As he looked around at most criminology schools, he decided that they had very little to offer in the way of crime prevention. In fact, most criminologists, to be frank, I hope there aren't any here, aren't the slightest bit interested in preventing crime or disrupting crime in any way. So the title of our department, Crime Science, is a very deliberate choice, and again I hope you'll understand its meaning more as my talk proceeds. So, why am I here? I don't mean that in an existential sense. I mean, why am I here today? Well, I'm here because, the same reason a lot of people are here, because they've met Paul Fine. In my case, Paul came and visited the JDI about 18 months ago, I guess. I can't quite remember. And he gave a very nice seminar on the parallel worlds of epidemiology and crime science. And we had a lot to agree on. We agreed that Jon Snow was a towering figure, and in fact, it may come as a surprise to you that we talk about the pump in our lectures to students, and that we often model, we draw a parallel between crime science and public health. We use the public health as an exemplar for how you can use prevention models. But as we talked further, we discovered actually we disagreed in a pretty fundamental way about what the message of Jon Snow was for crime science. And in fact, Paul's talk, I have to say, on the parallels, didn't really show very much parallels between epidemiology and crime science. So we discovered we were talking at cross purposes, and I think actually we might have even been talking at cross purposes as late as this week when he saw my presentation. I hope that's not a bad omen. So what's my argument? Let me go through it quickly, and then of course I'll elaborate. Many researchers say they're interested in crime, but in fact when you dig, they're interested in criminality. And I'm going to explain that these are quite distinct phenomena. Most epidemiological research likewise is interested in the phenomenon of criminality, to the extent that there's been epidemiological research in this area. So what I mean by that is they use the offender as the unit of analysis. So they'll either do a retrospective analysis where they'll take a whole bunch of offenders and find out things in the distant past that propelled them there, or they'll do a prospective study and head in the other direction. But at the end of the day, they're looking at why people become bad. I think Jon Snow actually provided a different blueprint, and I think he provided the blueprint for using crime as our unit of analysis, and that's what I want to talk about. So let me just elaborate a little bit here on crime versus criminality. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you think about it, although most people don't think about it. Criminality is a disposition, and crime's an event. Criminals don't always commit crime, and crime's not always committed by criminals. So, in other words, if you're a dedicated criminal, that's your life, you're out there making a living at being a criminal, even then you're not being a criminal 24 hours a day. You're being a criminal at particular times and particular locations. So there's something selective about when this criminality, so-called, comes out. Moreover, we know there's an awful lot of crime that's committed by people who wouldn't be regarded as criminals. And indeed, I guess most of us in this room, if we thought about it, would be guilty of some crime if it was committed at some point. And, this has been explored by a lot of researchers. Some people might be aware of the work of Philip Zimbardo, for example, who talked about the Lucifer effect, what makes good people bad. He used Abu Ghraib as the example, and he elaborated on his famous Stanford prison experiment from the late 60s. Anyway, another way to think about this is a shift from distal causes for crime, or distal risk factors if you like, to the proximal ones. And if you start thinking about crime as your unit of analysis, you start to think about the things that are happening around the time the crime is occurring as the causative agents, rather than things that happened in the distant past in the life of the offender. And as a general principle, we would hold that the closer a cause is to an event, the more powerful and more direct its effect is. So in other words, I could probably induce someone in this audience to punch me in the face by going up and being very aggressive to them, almost irrespective, well not entirely, but of whatever antecedents occurred in their back life. So what we're interested in is why, when, where and how crime occurs and what we can do to stop it. So I hope I'm going to make that distinction clearer. Well, I was very grateful for Nigel's talk yesterday because I guess I was feeling a bit nervous about presenting this to a group of epidemiologists, but much of what he said yesterday resonated with me, right down to the fact that we have a triangle as well. And our triangle has these components: the offender, the location and the target or the victim, and no crime can occur unless those three things are present. Okay? And part of our argument is, and again I'm picking up a little bit of terminology I think, is that in the past we've given far too much credence to host susceptibility. All right? So we've thought mostly about what it is about offenders that cause these events, and we've really neglected these two elements. Now, more than these three things being necessary, what we discover is that they only come together, or they tend to come together, in predictable ways. They tend to come together as part of the routine ebbs and flow of everyday life. So let me give you some examples. In fact, how this approach developed was the observation that there was a sudden shift in the strategies of burglars after the Second World War in the US. Burglary, as we all know from TV, usually involves someone with a mask and a sack on their head, striped thing, and they creep out at night and creep into your house and steal things while you're asleep. And indeed, that's what happened before the Second World War. That changed quite dramatically after the Second World War, when domestic burglary became a daytime event. Can anyone say why it suddenly shifted to being a daytime event after the Second World War? Anything? Women went out to work, exactly. So that fact changed the circumstances in which these three things would come together. And we see this for a whole lot of things. You know, my 92-year-old mother is frightened of crime and will probably never be a victim of one. My 25-year-old son isn't the slightest bit frightened of crime and has much more chance of being one because he is much more likely to put himself in a situation, by going to nightclubs and so forth, where he's meeting offenders in dangerous locations. So the usual way we understand the problem of crime, and I'm reprising something again that was said this morning, we want to see crime in terms of the characteristics of people. We want to see it in terms of bad people, and that's not a very productive way to go. And if we look for the cause of crime, typically what we'll do, and frankly what a lot of epidemiologists in this area have done, they look for things like deprivation, poverty, unemployment, poor education, and so forth. But there are a few problems with that. One of them is that crime's very ubiquitous. So many people commit crime. These are statistics for court appearances in the UK, and about a third of males have a court appearance by the time they reach their 40th birthday. I'm assuming not a third of this audience, but a third overall. So it's quite ubiquitous. Not only that, most age out of it. So this is a famous age crime curve. It's a very important and a very robust finding in our area that crime overwhelmingly peaks around, for males, around the age of 16, 17, 18. And most offenders, no matter what you do, age out of it. There's the one for females, slightly there as well, but as we've already talked about, crime and aggression is basically a male thing. Okay, so we tend to think about crime being related to poverty, poor education and so forth. It makes these kind of data very hard to explain. So this is showing crime rates over the last, well, from 1920 to about 2000. And what we see, of course, is that crime has steadily increased over this period at the same time that poverty has decreased, education has increased, and there's no evidence that parenting strategies have changed. Now, we also briefly talked this morning that this is starting to change. Since this is about 2000, from about 1990, we've had this slight change in the curve. And in fact, if we were to project this through to 2013, we'd find this dropping. And there's many explanations for that. I don't know that anyone has the complete answer, but one of the reasons might well be that through this period here, our opportunities to commit crime increased rather dramatically. And what we've been finding in the last few years, that those opportunities are decreasing as we get things like tracking of mobile phones, for example, the ubiquitous nature of CCTV and so forth. It's actually quite difficult sometimes to imagine committing crime and getting away with it. So, if we have that as our model, how do we usually try to control crime? Well, we do these kinds of things. We rely on the criminal justice system. We have a reactive model where we try to catch people after they've done their crimes. And if we want to ramp that up, we rely on tougher laws and so forth. And again, simply showing that kind of strategy simply isn't going to work. For every 100 crimes committed, we end up with about 1 conviction. And then if you want to go on to imprisonment and recidivism rates, we have further and further attrition. Catching offenders won't solve the crime problem. So what were the lessons that we learned from Jon Snow? Well, at a general sense, his focus on hypothesis testing, evidence-based intervention and so forth is what we take as our sort of guiding principle. That's the science part, I guess, of the crime science label. But the other part we take is a focus on crime, so the other part of the label. We are indebted to Jon Snow for introducing us to the value of maps, and just as you are in public health. So the issue of crime analysis. And we're also indebted to him for showing that sometimes interventions can involve pretty simple changes to the immediate environment. So the removal of the pump handle is a metaphor for us for situational crime prevention, for preventing crime through intervening at an environmental or locational level. I want to take you through some standard sort of crime patterns to show you what I'm talking about. The first thing, again, if you think about it, it's quite obvious, but most people don't think about it. Crime simply isn't random. Your chances of being a victim of crime vary dramatically in time and space. Very unlikely something's going to happen to you here in all sorts of areas. The risk of you getting your phone stolen, for example, is very low here. It's probably quite high when you go to the tube to get home. Those patterns are about the daily movement of offenders and victims that allow them to come together. And we see lots of evidence of crime clustering in hotspots. So just as Jon Snow mapped, cholera around the pump, we can map crime around crime generators. So here's just a couple of examples. Concentrate on this one here first. So that there is simply showing damage to cars by days of the week. Nothing particularly shattering about it, except to show that intuitively, as you might expect if you'd thought about it, the chance of your car getting damaged if you put it in the street peaks on Saturdays, Sundays, around there. We can go down to a smaller unit of analysis and look at what happens over a 24-hour period. So these are robberies in a town centre by the time of day. So not much activity here. People are asleep. They get up. They're pretty slow. Offenders pretty lazy, actually. They kind of work up. And even offenders have to eat. So they go off and have some dinner, and then they go back and do some more work. Now we can put these things together if you look at this thing here. So if you look up here, this is a combination of time and space. Let's wait till it gets to 24, which is midnight. So midnight, we're looking at crime in Harrow. Again, people are asleep, not much happening. 6 o'clock, starting to get up. 9, okay, so we're starting to get hotspots here of crime around the town centre, around midday, spreading up along the main road. Going down, oops, they're off to lunch again, dinner. Finish dinner, so we come back and do a little bit more, and so forth. We can analyse this in a little bit more detail. This is youth offending, and we're separating out here days of the week. So we're looking at weekdays versus weekends, and these little hats are schools. And by and large, although it's not perfect, we get these hot spots on the weekdays clustered around schools, and on weekends we get them more likely to be clustered around train stations and shopping centres. And if we look at a time analysis, again, it's quite obvious if you think about it. On a weekday, we get this huge spike around 3 or 4 o'clock. Why? Because the kids are getting out of school and they're all mixing out there in front of the school, and we don't get that peak on a weekday. On a weekend, I'm sorry. A few other things. One area of research in our field is journey to crime. We know offenders tend to not travel very far. Most offences occur within a mile of where they live, and there's this very rapid decay. Not only that, the majority, about 75%, occur between where the offender lives and works, so they don't even really deviate much from their normal path. Repeat victimisation, another phenomenon. If you're a victim of crime once, you're likely to be a victim again. We see this particularly with burglary. Well, not particularly with burglary, but it's very useful for burglary because we can target houses that have been burgled with a view of helping people prevent re-victimisation. If victimisation occurs, it tends to occur very rapidly and then again decays. So, if they're the environments, or they're the patterns for crime, if we go to those environments and find out what it is about them that's criminogenic, we can introduce some interventions. I'll go through this quickly because I'm very conscious of the time. I know I'm going to get gonged in a minute. One of the seminal studies in this was an observation by Ron Clark that there's this funny drop in suicides that occurred between 1958 and 1976. And when he looked at the data, he found that was almost entirely attributed to the drop in suicides by gas, which hitherto had been 40% of all suicides by gas. And when he went further, he discovered that that period exactly mirrors the conversion in the UK from coal gas to natural gas. And in fact, the changeover was very slow, and if you were to put a plot in there that was the percentage of carbon monoxide in the gas, it would almost mirror that drop. The interesting thing about this point is that the people who committed suicide by gas apparently didn't displace to other kinds of ways of committing suicide. And again, just some simple examples. When immobilisers were introduced around 1990, we had sudden drops in car crime. In fact, car crime drops are one of the most stable and robust of the crime drops in the last 15, 20 years. Almost all attributable to 2 minutes. That means I've got 2 minutes. So I'll be very quick. This is a drop in motorcycle thefts in Germany, and this was brought about quite unintentionally by making motorcycle helmets compulsory. And because offenders didn't want to walk around with a motorcycle helmet under their arm, we had this unintended drop in motorcycle. Where you park your car really matters. Street lighting does help reduce crime. That's a bit complicated to go through. A program called alley gating. Not only do putting gates on these alleys and giving the keys to the residents reduce littering, it reduces burglary by about 40%. A drug deal going down, so simple engineered redesign. Rather disgusting aspect of this, they deliberately made it curved down because these guys were urinating in the corner, and when they did that it would trickle on their feet. Redesign of a train station. Sometimes all people need is a nudge. You know, you don't need a big sign there. Same thing, a little nudge, and I'll leave that on for a second. Again, just a nudge. And I think I've got a second to go. There's my conclusions. Jon Snow is a seminal figure in crime science. When I give my lectures to introductory students, I talk about him, I talk about the pump, but I talk about him quite differently from the way a lot of the epidemiologists have in the literature, and I think the way Paul was imagining in the first instance. Offenders don't have a disease. Criminality is not a disease. And I don't think the analogy between disease and crime is rough enough, but it breaks down if you look at it that way. Perhaps it's more sensible to think about crime as the disease. Even that analogy is not perfect. So we think the distribution of cholera is a reasonable model for the distribution of crime, and we use removing the handle as a metaphor for interventions at the environmental level. And Paul suggested that maybe there are some parallels here with environmental epidemiology. I don't know. Maybe there are. Thank you.